Chapter 4, Frog and a Butter Churn. When Lyddie first came to the tavern, Willie built up the morning fire, but he overslept often, and several times the fire went out and someone had to be sent to the neighbors for live coals. The mistress was too mean to invest in a tinder box, but she was mortified to be thought a careless housewife who let her kitchen fire die, so she put Lyddie in charge of it. The first few nights Lyddie was fearful that she would not wake up early enough in her windowless room and slept on the hearth all night, so as to be sure to be the first up in the morning. Tryphena came in one morning and found her there, but instead of scolding, took pity. A sort of friendship began that morning. The cook was past her middle years and homely. She had never married, preferring, as she said, not to be a slave to any man. She was large and vigorous, impatient with Willie, who had to be told things more than once. But as the days wore on, won over by Lyddie's hard work and quiet ways. One morning, while Lyddie was churning, just as the cream was breaking into curdles, the cook told Lyddie about the two frogs who fell into the pail of milk. "One drowned right off," she said, nodding her head in the direction of the door, which had just slammed shut behind Willie's back. "But the other kicked, and in the morning they found him there, floating on a big pat of butter." Lyddie smiled despite herself. "Eh?" Tryphena continued. "Some folks are natural-born kickers. They can always find a way to turn disaster into butter." "We can still hop," Lyddie nearly laughed out loud. Tryphena cocked her head in question, but Lyddie's only smiled and shook her head. She couldn't share Charlie's joke with someone else. Autumn came all too quickly. The days grew suddenly short, and never, though she dreamed and plotted as she scrubbed the iron kettles and churned the butter and bellowed up the fire, never a chance to take the calf money home. There was no word from Charlie. Not that she truly expected a letter. They had neither money for stationery and postage, nor the time or energy for composition. She tried to keep him in her mind, to picture, as she lay upon her own cot, how he was growing and what he was doing. She rarely thought of Rachel or Agnes or their mother. The three of them seemed to belong to another, sadder life. The possibility of their father's return slipped into a back corner of her mind. She wondered once if he were dead, and that was why she seldom thought of him now. There was no pain in the thought, only a kind of numb curiosity. She and Charlie had left their mother's note and notes of their own to Papa on the table in the cabin, weighted down by the heavy iron candlestick, so, in case he returned, he would know where they were. But the old vision of him coming up the narrow track had faded like a worn-out garment. When she realized that the dream she had clutched for 3 years had slipped from her grasp, she wondered if she should feel bad that she had lost it. Her own voice said crossly within her head, "He shouldn't have gone. He should have never left us." The flaming hills of early October died abruptly. At last the dreary rains of late fall turned into the first sputterings of snow, until the world was beautiful once more with the silver branches of the bare trees and the lush tones of the evergreens against the gleaming banks of snow, so white you had to squint your eyes against it on a sunny day. The master put the wagons and carriages in the shed and set Willie to cleaning the mud off wheels and undercarriages, and the sleds were brought out. The stagecoach came less often now. Though there was plenty of work to be done in the short winter days, there were not many guests to feed or look after. The few who came seemed as closed and secretive as the freezing grayness of the weather, bent on some narrow business of their own. "Slave catcher," Tryphena was heard to mutter after one dark, sleekly well-dressed gentleman departed. "I don't like the smell of them." If she had been home, she might have spent the dark afternoons spinning or sewing, but the mistress bought her woolens and calicoes at the village store. She did not even card or spin the wool from their own sheep. It was sent to Nashua or Lowell, where it could be done in a gigantic water-powered mill. All the wealth that had once been Vermont's seemed to be trickling south or west. In fact, the master was heard to say that come spring the sheep would be sold, because the western railroads were bringing such cheap wool to the Lowell factories that a New England sheep farmer could no longer compete. It was what her own father had said, but his flock had been much smaller than Cutler's, so their family had felt the pinch years sooner. One late morning, as she was peeling and cutting potatoes for the boiled noon meal, she felt a presence behind her shoulder. Then someone tweaked her right braid. She looked about, annoyed, expected to see a sharp word or bothersome Willie. When she saw, it was Charlie. She stood up, the knife and potato still in her hand. "Oh," she said, "oh, you surprised me." He was grinning. "I meant to," he said. "You look well." "You're taller," she said. But it was a lie. He looked smaller than she remembered, but he would have been pained to hear that. "How are you, Charlie?" It wasn't a pleasantry. She really needed to know. "Still hoppin'," he said with a grin. Work is slow in winter, so they let me come see how you were." Now that she was seeing him at last, she hardly knew what to say. "Have you heard anything from Mamma and the babies?" she asked. He shook his head. His hair was longer, but neater somehow. A better barber than she had trimmed it. She realized it with a pang. "You're busy," he said. "I don't mean to hinder you." It was a stupid conversation, but both the cook and Willie were in the kitchen, and the mistress would be in and out. How could they say anything that mattered? "Have you been home at all?" she asked, turning back to her work and motioning him to sit in a low stool beside her. "No," he said. "Nor you, eh?" She shook her head. She wanted to tell him about the money, how she wanted to get it safely home, ask him what she should do, but she couldn't, of course, with others about. "I saw Luke a few times," he said. "He's been up once or twice to look at the farm. The house is fine." He lowered his voice. "He had a bit of a laugh about the way we blocked the door. He had to climb in the window." She didn't like the idea of Luke or anyone else climbing in the window. It made the cabin seem less secure. A coon or a bear might climb through the window as well, or a tramp. But she didn't comment. "Do they work you hard?" she asked softly. "He looks so small and thin." "They're fair. The miller works as hard as any of us hands. The food is plenty and good." "Then why aren't you bigger?" she wanted to ask him, but she held her tongue. After he had gone, she thought of 100 things she wished she had said. She could have told him about the frogs if she'd remembered to. He would have laughed, and she longed to hear his laugh. She was much lonelier after he went. His presence for an hour had rubbed off some of her protection, leaving her feeling raw and exposed. He had left about noon, carrying some bread and cheese Tryphena had pressed on him for his journey. He was wearing snowshoes that looked nearly as long as he was tall. Suppose it began to snow before he got back safely. Suppose he got lost. She tried to shake off her anxieties. Would someone let her know if something were to happen to him? It would be days, for they would let her mother know first, and then she might or might not write to Lyddie. It was too hard being separated like this. It was not right. "The weather will hold, eh?" Tryphena said, reading her mind. Lyddie sighed deeply. "You're worse than a little mother," the woman chided, but her eyes were softer than usual. The weather did hold for another 3 days, and then the blizzard of the winter came. The stock was watered and fed, the cows were milked, but there was little that Otis and Enoch, the 2 hired men, could do outdoors, so the kitchen was crowded with men, seeking the warmth of the great fire as they made spills for the March sugaring, whittling 4-inch segments of sumac, which they hollowed out with red-hot pokers. She thought of how she and Charlie had made spills last winter for tapping their own maples. Their own efforts were so childish compared to the practiced skill of these hired men. She could hardly move in the kitchen, large as it was, without tripping over the gangly legs of a man or having one of them bar her path to the fireplace with a poker. Tryphena crumbled continuously under her breath and rejoiced audibly when they left to tend to the livestock. But Lyddie didn't mind so much. Their bodies were in the way of everything she had to do, but as they worked, they talked, and the talk was a welcome window into the world beyond the tavern. "They caught another slave up near Ferrisburgh. The legislature can say all they want about not giving up to runaways, but as long as them rewards are high, somebody's going to report 'em." "Well, you got to decide." Enoch spat at the fire. His spit sizzled like fat on a hot griddle. "Who's in charge? Down in Washington, slavery's the law of the land. Man buys a horse fair and legal, he's sure as hell going after it if it bolts. You pay for something, it's yours. If the law says a man can own slaves, he's got a right to go after 'em if they bolt. Ain't no difference I could see. And if I happen to return somebody's property, seems to me I deserve a reward." Otis paused to pull his poker from the flames and thrust it, smoking through the center of the sumac spill he held. "None of them high and mighty folks in Montpelier offered to pay me $100 not to report a runaway, now have they?" "Well, this weather they likely to be froze 'fore you find 'em. You reckon the reward holds froze or thawed?" "Why do you suppose anyone would try to run in winter? Don't they know how easy it is to track a critter in the snow?" "The way I figure it, it's not snowing down there where they come from, eh? They don't know what it's like up this way. They just see a chance to run, they run. They don't give it good thought." "I'd give it good thought," Lyddie said to herself. "I get it all figured out close and choose my time right. If I was running, I'd pick me up a early summer night with a lot of moon. I just travel by night, sleep in the day." "Can you believe these fools?" Tryphena was saying in her ear. "They don't know what it's like to be trapped." Lydia had never seen a black person. She tried to imagine how one might look and act. In a way, she'd like to see one, but what would she do? What would she say? And supposing it was a fugitive, what then? $100? Would they really give you $100 for turning in a runaway slave? Surely with that much money she could pay off her father's debts and go back home. March came. The sap began to rise in the sugar bush, and Cutlers was in a frenzy of activity. Willie went with the hired men to help in the gathering and boiling of the sap. Mr. Cutler had built a large sugaring shed 2 summers ago, and the only time any of the men were around the big house was when the livestock needed tending to. Even then, Lyddie was called on to help with the milking and the feeding and the watering of the stock. Added to all her other chores was the task of clarifying the syrup brought up to the house. They had never bothered much with clarifying at the farm, as there had hardly been enough syrup or sugar for the family, but the mistress was very particular and stood over Lyddie, directing her. It was hot and exhausting work, beating milk in ash lye with syrup and boiling the mixture until the impurities rose to the top in a scum and could be skimmed off. But the mistress, who only watched and commanded, declared the light, clear syrup worth the effort. Some of the clarified syrup was boiled until it turned to sugar and was molded into fancy shapes. Lyddie's favorite among the lead molds was the head of George Washington, though sometimes the nose stuck and it was ruined. It was because of the molded sugar that Lyddie's dream of taking the calf money home came true, though she couldn't have known how that dream was going to come out.